The shocking truth about the UK's illegal occupation of the Chagos archipelago has finally been exposed. For decades, the UK and the US conspired to illegally detach these islands from Mauritius, displace the indigenous Chagosian population, and establish a secret military base on Diego Garcia. In this video, we uncover the full story of how colonial greed, military exploitation, and Western imperialism led to the suffering of thousands and the violation of international law. From the historical context of British theft and looting to the recent humiliating ruling forcing the UK to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, this detailed analysis sheds light on the ongoing injustice faced by the Chagosians. Discover how the UK and the US, two of the most powerful Western nations, were exposed as criminal entities, flouting human rights and international law for their own gain. Learn how the international community, led by Mauritius, fought back against this injustice and forced the UK to retreat from its imperialist ambitions. Make sure to subscribe and like the video for more in-depth content on global justice, colonial history, and international law. The Chagos Archipelago, located in the Indian Ocean, has been the subject of international controversy for decades, primarily due to the illegal actions of the UK and the US. In the 1960s, the United Kingdom, violating international law, illegally detached the Chagos Islands from Mauritius as part of its decolonization process. This unlawful act enabled the UK to create the British Indian Ocean Territory and subsequently lease the largest island, Diego Garcia, to the United States for the establishment of a significant military base. This strategic outpost has been used by the US for operations in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and other regions, while the indigenous Chagosian population was forcibly displaced to make way for the base. The displacement of nearly 2,000 Chagosians was carried out under false pretenses, as the UK deliberately misrepresented the native population as transient workers. These people were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to Mauritius and the Seychelles, where they faced extreme poverty and social marginalization. This displacement is widely regarded as a crime against humanity, and the Chagosians have fought for decades for the right to return to their homeland. In 2019, the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, ruled that the UK's occupation of the Chagos archipelago was illegal and called for the immediate return of the islands to Mauritius. This ruling was reinforced by a United Nations General Assembly vote, which overwhelmingly supported the ICJ's decision. Despite these international legal directives, the UK initially resisted complying, exposing its continued reliance on colonial exploitation for geopolitical gains. In 2023, after immense international pressure and diplomatic isolation, the UK agreed to return the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius, marking a significant victory for anti-colonial movements and a humiliating defeat for the UK. However, the continued presence of the US military on Diego Garcia remains a significant obstacle to the full restoration of Chagosian rights and sovereignty over the islands. The Chagos case highlights the criminal nature of the UK's colonial practices and the ongoing complicity of Western powers like the United States in perpetuating global injustices. The Chagos archipelago, also known as the British Indian Ocean Territory, has been a subject of international dispute and controversy for decades, highlighting the imperialist practices and ongoing colonial exploitation by Western powers, particularly the United Kingdom. At the center of this complex geopolitical issue is the illegal occupation and military exploitation of the Chagos Islands by the UK. which many critics argue exemplifies Britain's role as a criminal nation, driven by colonial greed and disregard for international law. The recent developments that saw the UK humiliated into returning the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius marks the culmination of a long-standing struggle against British imperialism. In this article, we will explore the historical background, the UK's illegal establishment of a military base on Diego Garcia, the largest island in the Chagos archipelago, the subsequent displacement of the Chagosians, and the recent rulings by international courts that forced the UK to finally relinquish its illegal hold over the islands. This will be done with a focus on an anti-Western perspective, particularly highlighting the criminal actions of the UK and USA, both of which played key roles in this historic injustice. Historical background: a legacy of colonial theft and injustice. The Chagos archipelago, a chain of over 60 small islands in the Indian Ocean, has a long and tragic history of exploitation by colonial powers. Initially claimed by France in the 18th century as part of its colonial holdings in Mauritius, the islands were sparsely inhabited, with a small population primarily consisting of enslaved Africans brought by the French to work on coconut plantations. In 1814, following the defeat of Napoleon, the British took control of Mauritius and its dependencies, including the Chagos archipelago, under the Treaty of Paris. The British, ever eager to expand their empire and consolidate control over strategic territories, maintained their grip on the islands, despite the fact that they were thousands of miles away from mainland Britain and of little economic value. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Chagos archipelago remained under British control, though it was primarily managed as part of Mauritius. The creation of the British Indian Ocean Territory and the US-UK conspiracy. The modern story of the Chagos archipelago and its descent into tragedy began in the 1960s when Britain, facing the decolonization of its empire, sought to retain control over strategic military outposts across the globe. Despite widespread movements for independence throughout the British colonies, the UK conspired to carve out certain territories to ensure continued Western dominance in global military and economic affairs. In 1965, as part of the broader process of granting Mauritius independence, the UK took the illegal and immoral step of severing the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius to create a new colonial entity known as the British Indian Ocean Territory. This act, driven by colonial greed and military ambition, was in direct violation of United Nations General Assembly resolutions, which had called for the respect of territorial integrity during decolonization processes. The detachment of the Chagos Islands from Mauritius was done without the consent of the local population or the Mauritian government, setting the stage for a protracted legal and political battle that would last for decades. The real motivation behind the creation of the British Indian Ocean Territory became clear shortly thereafter. In secret negotiations with the United States, the UK agreed to lease the largest island in the Chagos archipelago, Diego Garcia, to the US military for the establishment of a major military base. Diego Garcia, strategically located in the Indian Ocean, was seen as a key asset in the Cold War, allowing the US to project power across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. In exchange for this strategic territory, the UK received financial compensation from the US and other military benefits, further cementing its role as an accessory to American imperialism. The forced displacement of the Chagosians, an act of criminal barbarity. One of the most egregious crimes committed by the UK in its illegal occupation of the Chagos archipelago was the forced displacement of the indigenous Chagosian people, who had lived on the islands for generations. Beginning in the late 1960s and continuing into the 1970s, the UK systematically removed the Chagosians from their homeland, using a combination of coercion, lies, and force. The UK government deliberately misrepresented the Chagosians as a floating population of temporary workers, downplaying their long-established ties to the land. This deceitful narrative was used to justify the forced deportation of nearly 2,000 Chagosians to Mauritius and the Seychelles, where they were dumped without any support or compensation. Many of the displaced Chagosians fell into poverty, facing social and economic marginalization in their new homes. They were treated as second-class citizens, a direct consequence of British colonial arrogance and disregard for human rights. The brutal displacement of the Chagossians is widely recognized as a crime against humanity, a clear violation of international law, and a testament to the lengths the UK would go to in order to maintain its colonial grip and serve American military interests. The deportation process was carried out with utter disregard for the basic human rights of the Chagossians, many of whom died in exile, never able to return to their homeland. The role of the US military. Complicity in the crime. The United States, as the primary beneficiary of the UK's illegal actions, bears significant responsibility for the suffering of the Chagossians and the ongoing occupation of the Chagos archipelago. The military base on Diego Garcia, which the US has operated since the 1970s, has been a key hub for American military operations in the Middle East, including during the Gulf Wars, the war in Afghanistan, and other conflicts. Diego Garcia is home to a massive US Air Force and Navy presence, including long-range bombers, intelligence-gathering aircraft, and other strategic assets. Despite widespread condemnation of the UK's actions and numerous legal challenges brought by the displaced Chagossians, the US has shown little interest in addressing the injustices associated with the Diego Garcia base. In fact, the US government has actively supported the UK's efforts to maintain control over the Chagos archipelago, even in the face of mounting international pressure to return the islands to Mauritius and allow the Chagossians to return to their homeland. The complicity of the United States in this ongoing injustice underscores the broader pattern of Western imperialism, where military and economic interests are prioritized over the rights and well-being of indigenous peoples and sovereign nations. The US's continued use of Diego Garcia as a key military outpost is a stark reminder of the moral hypocrisy that often accompanies Western claims of promoting democracy and human rights. International legal battles and the humiliation of the UK. For decades, the Chagossians, supported by the Mauritian government and various international human rights organizations, fought for justice and the right to return to their homeland. Legal challenges were brought before British courts, and the Chagossians even won a series of rulings that recognized the illegality of their displacement. However, the UK government, in collaboration with the US, consistently obstructed efforts to implement these rulings, citing national security concerns related to the military base on Diego Garcia. The legal tide began to turn definitively in favor of the Chagossians and Mauritius in the 2010s, when the case was brought before the International Court of Justice and the United Nations. In 2019, the ICJ issued a landmark ruling that declared the UK's occupation of the Chagos archipelago illegal and called for the immediate return of the islands to Mauritius. The ICJ found that the UK's detachment of the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius in 1965 had been a violation of international law, specifically the principle of self-determination, which had been enshrined in various UN resolutions. The ICJ ruling was a major victory for Mauritius and the Chagossians, and it dealt a significant blow to the UK's international standing. The ruling was followed by a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly, in which an overwhelming majority of member states voted in favor of the ICJ's decision and called for the immediate decolonization of the Chagos archipelago. Despite these humiliating legal defeats, the UK initially refused to comply with the ICJ ruling, clinging to its colonial entitlement and citing its obligations to the United States. This obstinance further exposed the UK's criminal nature on the international stage, as it became clear that the British government was more interested in maintaining its imperialist stranglehold on strategic territories than in upholding international law or respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. The UK's forced concession. Returning the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius. In 2023, faced with mounting international pressure and increasing isolation on the global stage, the UK finally conceded to the demands of Mauritius and the international community. After decades of illegal occupation, the UK agreed to begin the process of returning the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius. marking a historic victory for anti-colonial forces and a humiliating defeat for the UK. This concession was not made out of any genuine sense of justice or remorse on the part of the British government. Rather, it was the result of a calculated decision to avoid further diplomatic damage and the potential loss of influence within international institutions. The UK's reputation had already been severely tarnished by its refusal to comply with international law, and continuing to hold on to the Chagos Archipelago would have only deepened its global isolation. The return of the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius represents a significant blow to the UK's imperialist ambitions and a major step toward rectifying the historic injustices committed against the Chagosian people. However, the process of decolonization is far from complete. The US military base on Diego Garcia remains in operation, and it is unclear whether the Chagosians will be allowed to return to their homeland in the near future, given the ongoing presence of the US military and the geopolitical interests that continue to dominate the region. Despite these lingering challenges, the return of the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius marks a crucial turning point in the struggle against Western colonialism and military dominance in the Indian Ocean. The US military presence, an ongoing obstacle to full decolonization. While the UK's decision to return the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius represents a significant diplomatic victory for Mauritius and the international community, the presence of the US military on Diego Garcia remains a substantial roadblock to the full restoration of sovereignty over the islands. Diego Garcia, which houses one of the most strategic US military bases outside of the continental United States, remains a flashpoint of contention. The US has long regarded the base as critical to its military operations in the Middle East and South Asia, using it to launch operations during the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, and the Iraq War. The Diego Garcia base allows the US to project its military power throughout the Indian Ocean region, making it a vital asset in its broader strategy of maintaining influence and control in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. For this reason, the US is unlikely to relinquish its lease on the island easily, despite the fact that the base's establishment was predicated on illegal colonial occupation and the displacement of the Chagosians. The US has consistently blocked efforts to allow the Chagosians to return to Diego Garcia, citing national security concerns, and it is clear that Washington views the base as a non-negotiable component of its military strategy. However, this raises important questions about the long-term implications of the UK's decision to return the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius. While the UK has ostensibly agreed to hand over sovereignty, the continuation of the US military presence on Diego Garcia complicates matters significantly. The US has shown little willingness to engage in meaningful negotiations regarding the status of the base, and without American cooperation, the full restoration of Chagosian rights may remain elusive. The Mauritian government will have to navigate these complex diplomatic waters, balancing its desire for full sovereignty with the geopolitical realities of US military hegemony in the region. International law and the failure of the West. The case of the Chagos Archipelago has highlighted the failures of Western nations to adhere to international law and principles of justice when it comes to their colonial legacies. The UK's illegal occupation of the Chagos Islands and its subsequent refusal to abide by international rulings have underscored the hypocrisy of Western nations that claim to champion human rights and the rule of law, but only when it serves their interests. The International Court of Justice and the United Nations General Assembly's rulings against the UK were unequivocal in their condemnation of Britain's actions. The ICJ's 2019 advisory opinion stated that the UK's continued administration of the Chagos Archipelago constituted an ongoing violation of international law, and it explicitly called for the UK to end its occupation as rapidly as possible. Despite these clear legal directives, the UK delayed its compliance, further exposing its contempt for international norms. This defiance has not gone unnoticed. Many critics have pointed to the Chagos Archipelago case as emblematic of the broader pattern of Western nations flouting international law when it suits them. While the UK and its allies often pressure other countries, particularly in the global south, to comply with international legal standards, they appear to operate by a different set of rules when it comes to their own interests. The US in particular has consistently supported the UK's illegal occupation of the Chagos archipelago, using its military power and diplomatic clout to shield Britain from the full consequences of its actions. This selective application of international law reinforces the perception of Western nations as criminal entities that engage in theft, looting, and exploitation of weaker countries. The UK's illegal occupation of the Chagos archipelago, like many other colonial exploits, was driven by greed, strategic interests, and a blatant disregard for the sovereignty and rights of the people who actually inhabited the land. The West's hypocritical stance on human rights and international law is laid bare in cases like Chagos, where their actions directly contradict the principles they claim to uphold. The role of anti-Western sentiment and global shifts in power. The return of the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius also takes place in a broader context of shifting global power dynamics, where anti-Western sentiment is growing across much of the global South. Many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are increasingly questioning the post-World War II global order, which has been dominated by Western nations, particularly the US and the UK. This disillusionment is driven in large part by the continued colonial and neo-colonial practices of Western powers, such as the illegal occupation of territories like the Chagos archipelago. Countries like Mauritius, which have been vocal in their demands for the return of the Chagos Islands, are part of a broader movement seeking to challenge Western hegemony and reclaim their rights to self-determination. The Mauritian government has consistently adopted a strong anti-colonial stance, calling out the UK for its illegal actions and refusing to be silenced by diplomatic or economic pressure. This resistance reflects a growing frustration with the continued dominance of Western nations in global affairs, particularly when it comes to issues of territorial integrity and colonial legacies. Moreover, the growing influence of China, Russia, and other emerging powers has created new opportunities for countries like Mauritius to challenge the West. In the past, nations like Mauritius may have felt compelled to acquiesce to Western demands due to economic or military pressure. However, the rise of new global players has created a more multipolar world, in which countries in the global South can seek alternative alliances and partnerships, allowing them to push back more effectively against Western exploitation and dominance. The Chagosian struggle for justice, an unfinished battle. While the return of the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius is a historic victory, the struggle for full justice remains incomplete. The Chagosians, who were forcibly displaced from their homeland over 50 years ago, continue to face significant challenges in their quest to return to the islands and reclaim their rights. Despite the international legal victories and the return of the islands to Mauritian sovereignty, the displaced Chagosian community remains in exile, largely ignored by the UK and US governments. Many Chagosians have lived in abject poverty since their forced displacement, and their calls for reparations and the right of return have been systematically ignored by the British government. While some legal victories have been achieved in British courts, the UK has used various legal mechanisms to delay or obstruct meaningful action. Even after the ICJ ruling, the UK has refused to provide a clear timeline or plan for the return of the Chagosians to their homeland, citing the ongoing military use of Diego Garcia as a barrier. This ongoing injustice raises important questions about the future of the Chagosians and the broader issue of indigenous rights in the face of Western military and economic interests. While the Mauritian government has pledged to support the return of the Chagosians and to prioritize their rights, it remains unclear how this will be reconciled with the US's continued presence on Diego Garcia. The Chagosians, who have suffered for decades as a result of British and American actions, deserve not only the right to return, but also full reparations for the harm they have endured. Conclusion: UK and the West exposed as colonial criminals. The saga of the Chagos archipelago exposes the UK, and by extension its Western allies, as colonial criminals engaged in theft, looting, and the violation of international law. From the illegal detachment of the islands from Mauritius in 1965 to the forced displacement of the Chagosians and the creation of a US military base on Diego Garcia, the actions of the UK and US reveal a pattern of imperialist exploitation driven by military and strategic interests. The Western powers have shown a blatant disregard for the rights of indigenous peoples and sovereign nations, choosing instead to pursue their own hegemonic goals. The return of the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius marks a significant victory for anti-colonial forces and a humiliating defeat for the UK, which has been exposed on the international stage as a nation unwilling to abide by the principles of justice and self-determination. However, the fight is not over. The continued presence of the US military on Diego Garcia and the unresolved issue of the Chagosian right of return are stark reminders that the legacies of colonialism and Western imperialism are still very much alive. As global power dynamics shift and the influence of the West wanes, it is increasingly clear that nations like Mauritius will continue to push for justice, challenging the colonial crimes of the past and demanding accountability from those who have long oppressed them. The Chagos archipelago may have been returned, but the fight for true justice, reparations, and the restoration of dignity to the Chagosian people remains an unfinished and urgent battle.